One of America's most iconic manufacturers has just pulled up stakes and left the country, taking with it billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. But this wasn't some hasty decision made in a boardroom under pressure. The wheels were already in motion long before tariffs hit. When steel and aluminum prices suddenly surged by nearly 30%, it wasn't just a bump in the road, it was the breaking point. Overnight, thousands of skilled workers found themselves without jobs, blindsided, and left behind. Their livelihoods became casualties in a larger, global chess game where profits always seemed to trump people. So why did Freightliner really leave? Was it a matter of survival? Or was something more calculated? Was this a cold business move cloaked in the language of necessity? And more importantly, what does it mean for your job, your town, and the future of Made in America? This isn't just the story of a truck manufacturer packing up and leaving. This is a deeper crisis, one that's been brewing beneath the surface, quietly eroding what we thought was untouchable. We're peeling back the curtain on one of the biggest manufacturing shakeups you've probably never heard about. Because this story isn't just about trucks, it's about a nation's identity and what we stand to lose when the foundation begins to crack. The so-called tariff trap played a central role. How does an industry titan fall? One decision at a time. For Freightliner, the choice to leave the U.S. wasn't just about trimming costs. It was about staying afloat. The tariffs, which are meant to shield American jobs, had the opposite effect. Instead of breathing new life into domestic manufacturing, they suffocated it. For a company that relies heavily on steel and aluminum, core materials in building heavy-duty trucks, the math became impossible to ignore. Prices skyrocketed, suppliers couldn't promise stable rates, and suddenly, each truck cost thousands more to produce. Margins disappeared, and investors started to worry. The global supply chain, once a strength, became a liability. With tariffs in place, importing essential parts turned into a logistical nightmare. The iconic trucks that once symbolized freedom and power now stood as monuments to economic gridlock. Freightliner's planners scrambled to find cost-effective solutions, but no matter how they sliced the numbers, they couldn't make it work. And to make matters worse, the media spotlight turned on them. News outlets pounced, exposing the irony of a company driven out by the very policies meant to protect it. A company rooted in American values, built on the backs of hardworking people and proudly stitched into the fabric of U.S. industry, had now left the country just to cut costs. The backlash was immediate and intense. Politicians were quick to point fingers, blaming poor leadership, a lack of patriotism, and what some called corporate cowardice. Social media lit up with outrage, hashtags demanding boycotts, and calls to hold Freightliner accountable. But beyond the noise, industry experts were warning of something far more serious. This wasn't just a one-off betrayal. It could be the beginning of a much larger trend, an exodus. The numbers quietly told the real story. Freightliner wasn't alone. Across the automotive and heavy machinery sectors, whispers of relocation had already begun. The tariffs, designed to safeguard American jobs, had instead sparked instability. Uncertainty rippled through boardrooms, and Freightliner's move became a symbol of a looming global manufacturing shift. This wasn't about just one company or one industry anymore. It was about survival in a changing world. Freightliner's exit signaled a larger, more troubling realignment in global production. As executives crunched the numbers, many came to the same conclusion. Staying in the U.S. simply didn't make economic sense anymore. Boeing quietly shifted key parts of its operations overseas. Harley-Davidson, once a proud symbol of American grit, announced a partial relocation to Thailand. Ford started exploring expanded operations in Mexico. The list of companies considering foreign alternatives was growing, and a message was unmistakable. America's economic climate had become hostile to its own manufacturers. For decades, Made in America was a badge of honor, a shorthand for quality, reliability, and pride. Now, that same label had become an economic burden. Freightliner's decision to leave wasn't just about quarterly profits. It was a sobering recognition that the rules of global business had changed. Staying put meant risking obsolescence. Meanwhile, competitors overseas watched with interest. Countries like China, India, and those in Eastern Europe saw opportunity in America's uncertainty. Their governments offered tax breaks, cheap labor, and looser regulations to lure away the factories that once thrived on U.S. soil. Freightliner's move triggered a ripple effect. Other manufacturers, watching closely, began re-evaluating their own futures. Some doubled down on American roots, vowing to weather the storm. Others quietly made plans, explored foreign options, or began restructuring altogether. In factory break rooms and executive offices alike, a new feeling had taken hold: uncertainty. And then came the political firestorm. In Washington, the mood shifted from pride to panic. The Trump administration, which had touted tariffs as a way to bring jobs back home, suddenly found itself on the defensive. Freightliner's departure seemed to contradict the very foundation of that strategy. Critics from both parties lined up to attack the policy, arguing it had backfired. Supporters of the tariffs claimed companies like Freightliner were simply using the situation as a convenient excuse to chase bigger profits abroad. They accused executives of turning their backs on American workers, putting shareholders above community loyalty. But the question now being asked, behind closed doors and out in the open, was even more unsettling. What if the biggest threat to American industry wasn't coming from China or Mexico? What if it was a domestic failure? A system that no longer supports the very companies it was supposed to protect. Meanwhile, critics of the administration's tariff policy argued that the economic fallout was not only severe, it was entirely predictable. They pointed to a failure to grasp the complexity and interconnectedness of modern manufacturing, where supply chains stretch across borders and rely on delicate balances of cost, logistics, and regulation. As the reality of Freightliner's exit set in, union leaders took to the streets, organizing protests and speaking out against both the company and the government policies that had driven it away. Their message was clear: American workers were paying the price for political miscalculations. In South Carolina, the impact was visible and visceral. A once bustling Freightliner factory sat eerily still. The lot that used to overflow with cars during shift changes now sat half empty. Local politicians scrambled for solutions, promising job retraining programs and investment incentives. But for many, the damage had already been done. Media coverage intensified. Headlines proclaimed the death of American manufacturing, while pundits debated whether Freightliner's departure was an isolated case or the first domino in a much larger collapse. Calls for legislative reform grew louder, but in the noise, no clear plan emerged. And deeper in the supply chain, the shockwaves were just beginning to hit. Suppliers who had built their businesses around Freightliner's contracts found themselves suddenly without orders. Trucking companies that had delivered parts and materials to the factory were left scrambling as contracts were canceled. The disruption extended far beyond the plant itself, reaching into industries and communities that had no direct connection to truck manufacturing, at least not on the surface. As political leaders searched for answers, one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. Protecting American jobs in a globalized economy takes more than tariffs and patriotic slogans. It requires a cohesive, long-term strategy, one that balances economic realities with national values. Freightliner's exit showed just how far from that balance the country had drifted. If you're finding this breakdown insightful, don't forget to subscribe. We've spent countless hours researching the real story behind Freightliner's departure, pouring through economic reports, insider accounts, and policy analysis to bring you the full picture. Because for the workers left behind, this isn't just a business headline. It's life-changing. For decades, Freightliner's factories were more than just places to clock in. They were the heartbeat of entire communities. Generations of families built their lives around these jobs, trusting that loyalty and hard work would be met with stability and security. That trust shattered the day the closure was announced. Take David Martinez, a machine operator who worked at the North Carolina plant for 25 years. His father had spent a lifetime there before him, and David had always imagined one day passing the torch to his own son. When news broke that the plant was shutting down, it wasn't just about losing a paycheck. For David, it felt like losing a part of his family's identity. He wasn't alone. His co-workers shared the same heartbreak. These were lives built on the promise of reliable hours, decent wages, and the dignity that comes from building something real. Now, that purpose had been replaced by anxiety and uncertainty. The initial shock was painful, but the long-term consequences were even more devastating. This wasn't just about lost wages. It was about healthcare benefits gone, pensions put at risk, and retirement plans thrown into question. Things that once felt permanent, foundations people built entire lives on, had suddenly vanished. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. In today's economy, Even the most trusted institutions can disappear in the blink of an eye, leaving ordinary people to pick up the pieces. Workers who had devoted decades, their best years, to Freightliner felt blindsided and abandoned. Their dedication, once considered the backbone of the company, now seemed written off as disposable. The factory closure was not just the end of a job. It was the beginning of an uphill battle for survival. Local leaders scrambled to contain the fallout, organizing job fairs, rolling out emergency vocational programs, and trying to stem the tide of economic collapse. But for many of the displaced, especially those in their 50s or 60s, the idea of starting over was more than daunting. It was heartbreaking. Highly skilled machinists, welders, and technicians suddenly found their expertise didn't translate easily to other industries. At a local diner near the now-quiet plant, former Freightliner employees gathered for coffee and hard conversations. Some considered moving to states where manufacturing still held promise. Others talked about going back to school or retraining in completely new fields: trucking, HVAC repair, plumbing, anything that could bring in a reliable paycheck. As the sun set over the factory that had once shaped their lives and futures, a heavy cloud of uncertainty loomed. When a factory shuts down, it's not just the workers who suffer, it's the entire town. In places like Gaffney, South Carolina, where Freightliner was the primary employer, the announcement hit like a thunderclap. The economic shockwave rippled outward. Local businesses, restaurants, hardware stores, repair shops had long depended on the daily flow of factory workers. Without them, those businesses faced ruin. Pauline's Cafe, a beloved spot just down the road from the plant, saw its customer base vanish overnight. Waitresses who used to greet regulars by name now worked empty shifts. The cafe's owner, Mary Perkins, tried to stay optimistic, but her voice trembled as she wiped down the counter. "We've served these folks for years," she said. "Now they're gone. And we're next." The local school district, which relied heavily on tax revenue from the plant, prepared for budget cuts. Programs that once gave students a competitive edge, like robotics clubs, shop classes, and advanced manufacturing tracks, were on the chopping block. Teachers who had spent their careers preparing kids for stable futures in industry suddenly found themselves questioning everything. The impact even reached the housing market. Real estate agents faced a flood of listings as families uprooted in search of work. Property values near the plant plummeted, and once thriving neighborhoods were now dotted with for sale signs. Some homeowners, trapped in underwater mortgages, faced financial ruin with no clear way out. Inside Town Hall, local officials and residents gathered for a tense emergency meeting. Emotions ran high. Some blamed Freightliner for abandoning its roots and its people. Others blamed government policies that had made domestic manufacturing unsustainable. Amid the shouting and finger-pointing, one truth stood unchallenged. The community had been left to fend for itself. And just as Gaffney tried to regroup, rumors started swirling in the next town over. Another plant might be closing soon. The workers, already shaken, braced for the worst. What once felt like isolated incidents now felt like a pattern. And a grim realization began to take hold. This wasn't just a single factory closure. It was a slow unraveling of the American industrial heartland. This wasn't just a business closure. It was the unraveling of a social contract that had held entire communities together for generations. Beyond the immediate financial fallout loomed a deeper, more unsettling transformation, a cultural shift. What was lost wasn't only jobs, but identity. Freightliner had been more than just a workplace. It was a cornerstone of pride, tradition, and purpose. Workers didn't merely assemble trucks. They carried on a legacy of American craftsmanship. The Freightliner badge wasn't just a logo. It was a symbol of belonging, reliability, and the vital role these workers played in keeping the country moving. When the factory gates closed for the last time, that sense of purpose evaporated. The constant hum of machinery that had once filled the air fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness. For workers who had dedicated decades to the company, it was like losing a part of themselves. The vacant lots where the plants once stood weren't just empty. They were haunting reminders of what had been lost. The collapse wasn't just financial, it was personal. It struck at the heart of what it meant to be a part of America's industrial story. For younger generations, the impact was equally devastating. Many had grown up watching their parents and grandparents build lives around these factory jobs. Freightliner represented stability, respect, and a clear path to a better future. Kids imagined following in those footsteps, learning the trade, earning a good wage, and one day raising their own families with the same security. But with Freightliner's sudden exit, those dreams vanished. What once seemed like a solid career path now looked like a dead end. If even a company as iconic and deeply rooted as Freightliner could pull out, what hope was there for anyone? The idea of generational continuity, of skills and values passed from one era to the next, now felt outdated and risky. Cultural historians began to sound the alarm. This wasn't just a shift in the economy. It was a rupture in the very fabric of American identity. For decades, Made in America was more than a slogan. It was a declaration of strength, resilience, and national pride. It stood for the idea that American workers, with their hands and their hearts, could build products that rivaled the best in the world. It was a point of pride passed from parent to child. But now, that pride felt like a relic. Overshadowed by boardroom decisions and corporate bottom lines, it became clear that profit had trumped loyalty. Worker unions fought back, tried to rekindle solidarity, and push for accountability. They organized protests and demanded legislative reforms that would protect workers when companies abandoned their roots. But their message often struggled to cut through the disillusionment. People who had given everything to the system now questioned whether it had ever truly valued them in return. Freightliner's departure wasn't just the end of an era. It was a wake-up call, one that asked whether the values America once held dear, loyalty, hard work, community, still had a place in a global economy that seemed to reward only the bottom line. How could workers continue to believe in collective strength when even the most loyal among them were discarded so easily? Solidarity, once a rallying cry that united generations of laborers, now felt painfully hollow in the face of relentless globalization. The cultural impact of Freightliner's departure wasn't confined to Gaffney or even North Carolina. It sent shockwaves across the country. Workers in steel, auto, aerospace, and countless other industries began to ask the same question. Are we next? The collapse of Freightliner's operations shattered a once common belief that factory jobs offered lifelong stability and respect. As more manufacturing shifted overseas, workers were left questioning the very premise that loyalty and hard work would be rewarded. The fallout wasn't just about lost paychecks or pensions. It was about a fundamental loss of trust in the system. The unspoken promise that hard work equals security had been broken, and in its place was a growing sense of betrayal. Freightliner's exit forced communities to confront painful questions about what job security really means in a global economy. Could anyone count on a company's word anymore? And if not, what replaced the old values of loyalty, tradition, and stability? In town meetings, on factory floors, and at kitchen tables across America, a new debate took root. Was this collapse driven by unchecked corporate greed or by flawed government policy? The political fallout was just as intense as the economic and cultural collapse. Freightliner's departure became a lightning rod for national conversation about the balance between protecting domestic industries and allowing free market forces to dictate corporate strategy. The Trump administration, which had touted tariffs as a powerful tool to revive American manufacturing, suddenly found itself under fire. Instead of bringing jobs back, critics argued those very tariffs were driving jobs away. Political analysts from both sides of the aisle rushed to offer their take. Conservative voices blamed Freightliner's leadership, accusing the company of exploiting the policy climate to justify a move they had planned all along. They claimed it was about profit, not policy. On the other hand, liberal commentators argued that the tariffs had created a hostile business environment. With rising costs, unpredictable supply chains, and reduced global competitiveness, companies were being pushed out of the country, not pulled. Capitol Hill turned into a battleground. Lawmakers demanded hearings, summoning Freightliner CEO to testify before Congress. Angry workers, union leaders, and community members gave emotional statements, describing how their lives had been upended. Their testimonies echoed with frustration and heartbreak, painting a picture of a nation caught between economic ambition and the harsh reality of global interdependence. In the end, the question wasn't just whether the policy had failed. It was whether the system itself had forgotten who it was supposed to protect. Freightliner's departure wasn't just a corporate move. It was a moment of reckoning for American labor, American politics, and the American dream. For many Americans, Freightliner's exit wasn't just about the loss of jobs. it felt like a deep betrayal by both employer and government. Workers who had devoted decades to building something tangible were left with little more than broken promises and uncertainty. That betrayal gave rise to a new wave of social movements demanding better protections for those affected by sudden factory closures. Advocacy groups began pushing for sweeping reforms, including legislation requiring companies that benefit from federal contracts or subsidies to commit to long-term domestic production. It was a bold vision, one aimed at tying corporate incentives to community stability. But whether such measures could gain bipartisan traction in Washington remained unclear. As national media picked up the story, they began connecting the dots. This wasn't just about Freightliner. It was a pattern. A growing number of American manufacturers were packing up and moving operations overseas. News outlets ran feature stories asking, "Is this the future of American industry?" And with each passing day, it became harder to deny. This was bigger than one company. The real issue at stake was the future of American manufacturing itself. Protecting American jobs would take more than patriotic slogans or reactionary tariffs. It would require an honest reckoning with global economic forces, a commitment to smarter trade policies, and above all, corporate accountability. But in the halls of Congress and the boardrooms of multinational companies, finding common ground was proving nearly impossible. Each side of the debate, business leaders, policymakers, labor advocates, dug in deeper, convinced their perspective was the only path forward. Meanwhile, the damage spread. Freightliner's decision didn't just send shockwaves through one community. It triggered a corporate domino effect across the country. The relocation of a $35 billion U.S. production line was more than a spreadsheet adjustment. It was a signal to every major manufacturer that keeping operations domestic might no longer be viable. And others followed. Harley-Davidson, already squeezed by international tariffs, fast-tracked plans to move more motorcycle production to Thailand. Ford expanded its operations in Mexico, distancing itself from escalating costs in the U.S. Boeing, facing skyrocketing expenses due to tariffs on aerospace parts, sought new global partnerships to mitigate financial strain. The trend was undeniable. Freightliner's departure had opened the floodgates. What made the company's decision especially devastating was the symbolism. Freightliner wasn't just another manufacturer. It had long stood for durability, consistency, and the promise of American industrial might. Its trucks represented strength on the open road. But when Freightliner moved overseas, that powerful image cracked. Confidence across the sector crumbled. If Freightliner couldn't survive here, who could? The automotive industry felt the impact first. Supply chains that once depended on Freightliner's domestic production began to collapse. Parts manufacturers lost major contracts. Trucking companies, many of which had tailored their services around Freightliner's plants, watched their business dry up. What had been a tightly woven web of logistical and economic partnerships began to unravel. And then came the ripple effect. Small towns and local economies that had endured past recessions now faced an existential crisis. Communities built around manufacturing, the same ones politicians often pointed to as symbols of American grit, were left vulnerable, not just to job losses, but to a deeper erosion of identity, pride, and long-term viability. What started with one company's decision had now become a defining moment for an entire sector, and perhaps for the nation itself.